So this last one, I've been, I don't know, I guess it's fortunate. I'm compiling notes as you all were hearing this really great discussion. And when you're one of the last speakers, you're discovering, oh, wow, they hit that point. Well, they hit that point really well. I don't need to do that one. So I'm going to condense a little bit of this last portion that CTV has a program called Maximize Your Voice. And every other season, every election cycle, I saw a bunch of hands. Who are precinct delegates here? Yeah, like 3/4 of the room. James, come on up for a second. So in our books, in our folders, on that one side, we created this booklet that talks about being a precinct delegate. Now, you guys are precinct delegates, but guess what? Next year, they'll be looking for a whole nother, either you're running again or there might be areas in your counties that need precinct delegates. This is kind of a real basic primer. What is it? How do I be one? And it's a great, thing for you to use if you're talking to someone in your neighborhood or in your county. The other thing you're going to see, I want to bring, because it will go fast this afternoon, biblical principles for public policy, how to be a responsible Christian citizen. Your pastor would really love this. After you read it, your pastor would really appreciate this as you go to your churches. And maybe you start a voices, issues and voices committee where you talk about the issue of the day and you're someone the pastor trusts. But start with this so he understands where you're coming from and there's a biblical foundation. James did the bulk of this work way long before I came, and it's really excellent resource. The other part of this folder is, I'll touch on this later, communicating with legislators, how a bill becomes a law, the do's and don'ts of churches. Churches can do a lot. And the other side is Proverbs for the politically active. So just to draw your attention, take your folders home, but we hadn't touched on that earlier, and I didn't want you to miss it. This next section is quickly going to be talking about precinct delegates for a moment and what you can do. Now you are. Now what? What do you do? And I wanted James to come up here because when he started, he was recruiting thousands of precinct delegates. And James, what did you discover after you did that?
I discovered there's a difference between zeal and wisdom. I had zeal at 150, and my wisdom peaked out at -20. My first county convention, I showed up with 90 precinct delegates elected, enough to take over the whole county. And I had never made a political motion and never been in a political meeting in my life. And I was in charge. Does that sound familiar? The inmates are running the asylum. But I knew I was there for a reason and a purpose, but I had no experiential wisdom on how to be engaged without being obnoxious. My zeal was amazingly high, and Eileen remembers those days. I mean, it was crazy. The idea of becoming a precinct delegate, it's the lowest elected office anyone can be a part of. It's the building blocks of every other thing that goes on in the local area. And it's such an important position. It's such an important position. And yet, if in our mind we devolve it to a pure power struggle in our zeal to want to do good, then we're just playing on the world's terms rather than on the kingdom terms. Because Jesus said, remember I told this earlier, he who is faithful in a very little thing, I will make ruler over much. The reason I quote that is because I'm preaching to myself, because that's what I did. I went from 0 to I was going to run the whole world in 2 years. An inheritance gained too soon comes to ruin, Proverbs says. And the other scripture that's so important for those of us who engage the political arena is Jesus said, he who wishes to be great among you must become the Servant of all. And you know what all means in the Greek? All. And I didn't know that principle. And I thought if I just show up and I get in a position of leadership and I can tell everybody what to do, that's great, don't you think? Don't you think? The answer is no. Because I would not want an airplane pilot doing my heart operation, no matter how good of a pilot he was. And just because you're a pastor, and just because you're a Christian, and you have your morals together, and you understand the difference between right and wrong, I might not want you running my political show. Your zeal does not mean you have wisdom. Your desire and your love for God does not mean that you're the person who should be in charge. It does mean that you're called to be the servant of all. If you ever lose sight of that, you have capitulated and you have played on the world's terms, and I don't believe God will honor it. I'm sorry to say that to some people because we feel like we're in this because we've got to retake power and we've got to retake this, and we do. But that's the result of a servant-hearted attitude. That's the result of being faithful in a little. It's not our primary goal. Our primary goal is to be the servants of all. So what does that mean? It means I serve good people and I help them get elected. It means I serve good legislation and how do I get it passed? It means I oppose bad stuff. But it doesn't mean that my only goal is to beat whatever political enemy I have in my local area. And you guys know how vicious local politics can be. Have you noticed? I've had lifelong friends who have loved each other and laid their lives down for each other, who happen to disagree on a local political issue, who become lifelong enemies. Still have the same values, still love the same Jesus. Sometimes go to the same church. And so my admonition, I'm sorry, I got to preach this because it's so important that we not lose sight of who we are in our striving and in our goal to try to restore godly principles to our land. Amen? We've got to do it. If you're going to identify as something, identify as a follower of Jesus who's there to serve and be faithful. And let God promote you. That happened to me. One quick story. After my big zealous thing, the Robertson campaign, all that, we could have taken over the whole thing, and we almost did, and we had no clue what we were doing, and we couldn't have raised a dime if our life depended on it. Sounds familiar? And God hit me between the eyes. You talk about the 2x4 revelation. And I realized that I was a self-righteous, arrogant, condescending person who demonized anyone who didn't agree with me 100%. And I felt so convicted. And I repented. And after that, I went to all the people that I knew of. And these were, if I named the names, you would know a lot of these names. And I went and I sat with them and I repented. And I said, I'm sorry for those Christians of us who are just, accusers and demonizers and self-righteous. We have a lot of zeal, but we don't have much wisdom. And I want to repent and I want to ask, how can I serve you? And that one, I called it my statewide sackcloth and ashes tour. I literally went and repented. And some of these people who were Christians, who loved God, who happened to be on a different political angle than I was at that moment, literally had tears in their eyes because they'd never seen that before. And I can honestly say, whatever influence I had up to that point, God multiplied it so much more than anything. I tried to storm the gates of the castle. That was my plan. And God's plan was to go in humility and serve. I got more favor and more accomplishment and more influence through doing it God's way than I ever would have gotten in my own way. And so that's my admonition to us as believers. I'm so glad you're a precinct delegate, but just don't get caught up in all of the little petty stuff. There's a story about Israel under attack by the Romans back in the 1st century or 2nd century, and there was the battle was coming and the enemy was coming and approaching, and they were on the ramparts. And they're called, the military, they were supposed to defend the city from the attack, right? Do you know what they were doing on top of the walls? They were fighting each other. The enemy didn't have to beat them. They were defeating themselves. That's just stupid. Sometimes we can be so stupid, and we're so short-sighted and so enamored with the battle, we forget there's a bigger picture. And Benjamin Franklin said it like this: we must all hang together, or ladies and gentlemen, we shall all certainly hang separately. So do your stuff, but do it in the Spirit of God.
Amen. That's why I just wanted to have you hear that. These are really important times, and so our language, our communication, how we talk, even our faces. I loved Dave. I think he had to leave. He said, smile. That is so disarming if you're trying to make a really important part, and then all of a sudden you're getting attacked. And you show that it's not penetrating and that you are still maintaining a gracious demeanor, well, you've just defeated the enemy, And let God fight their hearts. But there are a couple things. So your precinct delegates, some of you are like, well, now what do we do? There are lots of things you can do. I see Norm Schinkel in the audience, and he is always looking for people to help on county party, canvassing neighborhoods. One of the main things you were elected to do is two things. You go to your county conventions, and at your county conventions, you elect people to your state conventions, of which you are electing some of your statewide candidates. They're very important positions. It's an important position. But again, maintain a servant heart. I just want to reinforce that. Another thing is, when you find a good candidate you really like, then volunteer, help them. They're always looking for help. That is like gold, right, Norm? I mean, Norm, you ran this last time. I'm sure you would have appreciated more volunteers. And, when I got my job, I had a master's degree in public policy when I came back to work in Michigan with James, and I was like couch surfing and asking people for $10 for a name for the nameless and for this pro-life project that we did around the whole state. But from that tour, I'm like, God, I can't believe you're calling me back from Washington, D.C. I'm doing a job where I have to raise my own salary, and I don't have a place to live. I'm couch surfing. And do you know what he did in that job, though? He introduced me to Michigan in a whole new way I had never known, by talking to all these churches, Catholic, Protestant, any church that would open their door and give me 5 minutes to talk about the unborn. I was there, and I was literally up and down the entire state. Well, then I was hired by a U.S. Senate campaign, because they're like, oh my gosh, she's been all over the state. She knows all these people. And then I had to say goodbye to James. He's like, man. And I went on and worked on lots of campaigns for a state senator. Dick Posthumus was the Senate Majority Leader. But I mean, I learned that, I had to learn the ropes just like everybody else did, and let God teach you the way He wants you to learn. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're in a big paid position at first, but it ends up that is a valuable experience, and how you approach it in your attitude and in your communication makes a difference. The other thing that we wanted to kind of quickly touch on is that as you're helping your local parties and your candidates get elected, make sure you are attending. This is what this is all about. It's the candidates, but it's also you elected people. You got school board members here, city commission people here. I think we have some county commissioners, and you've heard this morning, today, where are you? They need you. Even if you don't want to talk, they need to see a friendly face in front of them. I just talked to a young woman who heard at our Political Leadership Academy in October, we were training candidates. She said, I felt motivated from that training to go and run for my city council meeting, city council in Lake City. And she goes, I am the only conservative, and it's really hard. And she's hanging in there, and I'm so proud of her. And she's going to hang in there, but I'm hoping that when she goes back to Lake City, we can help her find some other like-minded friends to be in the audience, to speak up, to send emails, so she's not feeling like she's the lone, the lone voice crying in the wilderness. But that is another thing. Precinct delegates, that's what you can do. Find one township meeting a month. Be consistent. Don't just go, you get all involved in one issue. At the school board, it's, sexual orientation, and they're teaching our kids really bad stuff. And you show up for 2 really big meetings full of people, and then everyone's gone. And no one comes to any more meetings. Well, guess what? You heard on this panel, when they don't see people that are there consistently, you're not building relationships. You're just coming to storm the gates, yell, scream. I mean, there are times when you need, and I'll get to that, when you need masses of people. I'm not saying you don't need people to storm the gates for some issues, but then don't disappear. Don't disappear. I can tell you one thing. I've had to recently. We've, as you know, we get involved in statewide elections. We do some research, and in election years, we target the races that we feel that CTV can make an impact to have a pro-life, pro-family majority. And so about 7 races, we hire field coordinators, and we distribute voter guides that we have an extensive candidate endorsement process. Some of you know this, some of you don't. And they have to answer specific questions, and one of our deal breaker questions is on that expansion of the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. And some of our endorsed candidates voted for it, even though it didn't have the religious amendment, the freedom of conscience amendments attached to it. So I'm in the enviable position of going to all these legislators and saying, why did you break your promise? And what, I go in first in prayer, and then I'm like, wow, I haven't had the chance even, things happen so fast. I think Dave Coleman said it. I think lots of things were planned last November because things were happening so fast. I didn't even have a chance to get to all of our endorsed candidates and talk to them ahead of time. Thank you, you won, that's great. So this is the first time they're meeting me, and I'm saying, okay, explain to me, why did you break your promise? And what I'm learning is, 1, some took very bad advice. 2, some felt like it's already law. The Supreme Court passed it, and I'm not going to get into all the reasons. And our PAC board will decide eventually. First people were calling for me to, do recalls and change. Let's unendorse them. And our PAC board, I said, just hang on. I need to talk to my PAC board. We are getting letters back from them, written letters, to give us a written explanation of why they chose to break their promise on an endorsement that we made. And then our PAC board will decide what the consequences are. But first, I needed to see them and look them in the eye. And I'll tell you what, I've built some unusual relationships that I didn't realize that I would have. And what I also discovered, like one representative on the life issue looked at me and she goes, well, Eileen, we passed Proposal 3. It's in the Constitution. So I figured I was voting according to the Constitution. And I looked at her and I said, slavery was in the Constitution. It didn't make it right. And I said, and shame on us. We didn't really, as much as we could have, and the media plays a portion of that. But I said, look, you had a really good argument you could have gone to. Not that it's the repeal of the 1931 law. It's, hey, let's maintain this portion of that law that protects women from heinous, botched abortions. And I said, you would have had a message. She's in a very, very liberal district. You know how she won her district? She showed me her map. We had an hour discussion. She has Bloomfield and all these other, she is a school board member. She was in Orion Township. She had a very, very solid core of a base of people who believed in her. And so and then I looked at her, I'm like, what are you going to do about parental consent? What are you going to do about when they try and repeal informed consent? I said, you have to understand, we may have to change our endorsement. She goes, yeah, I know, I'm just doing what I think I should do, and I understand you might have. And I said, but let's talk. And I said, so you're a parent, right? You would not want someone to take away your right as a parent to know if your 14-year-old daughter has an abortion. And, and so it was a really good dialogue. And I feel confident that, I said, use us. Use us when you're struggling with how do you talk about issues and you're getting blowback from the rest of your district. Help us help you. So that's what I want to share to you as precinct delegates. There are some legislators that I don't know all the ones that you're representing, but where you're arguing with them or you're thinking, they're a rhino, they're an establishment, give them the good reasons why they need to vote in principle with their principles. Help them understand it, because I'm telling you, they're not thinking through these. Now, some are, and they'll be primaried. I mean, whatever. Some are. But from the conversations I'm having, I'm seeing these legislators, one, are feeling like, oh, it's already law, and they need a good primer from William Wagner about the Constitution. And the second is feeling like they're not hearing back. I went to a conservative guy in part of the kind of thumb area, and he voted incorrectly on the Elliott Larson bill. He voted correctly on the abortion bill. And I'm going to give Genevieve a few minutes to talk about the abortion bills, because we're all about life, And I looked at him, I said, why did you break your promise? Why did you answer this way? I said, you were from a conservative district. What, are you getting all kinds of pressure? What? He goes, no. I said, well, what are you saying to your constituents that you voted for this bill? And he looked at me, he goes, well, I don't hear from anyone. I haven't heard anything from anyone. And I'm like, I was cringing inside. So there you go. Do your emails to your legislators. When we're sending alerts out, then you'll get them because you're going to be on our mailing list. If you want to unsubscribe, that's fine. But we try and send alerts. This bill is coming. They need to hear you. They need to hear you. If he had gotten 500 emails from his conservative district saying, hey, do not say yes on this bill unless it includes these important amendments, he would not have voted for it. He was in a safe district, and he had a very interesting perspective on that one too, William. I have to. But anyway, I'm giving you those examples because I want you to understand, have the conversation. You heard over and over today, have the relationship, have the conversation. Get into their headspace and let them hear you. Let them hear your heart. Because I laughed some of them. I said, thank you. I wanted to meet you face to face before our board makes these decisions. And we do appreciate you sending a written response. And I think they respected that. And you know what? I need to go back to them later on when we have really big important things like parental consent laws that they're going to try and get rid of, informed consent laws. Genevieve is on the front lines on that right now, and so are we in testimony, but lots more is coming down the pike. So I can't just dismiss everybody who votes wrong. We have to woo them. We got to get these people understanding principally why they should be voting for what. And then, we may disendorse, some of these people. My PAC board will have a discussion, but the idea is not now. And I had another member say, "Well, yeah, I wondered CTV," blah, blah, blah. And he had never met me, and I explained what I was doing, what we were doing, going back to all the legislators, and I could see this legislator looking at me like, "Oh, okay, yeah." Yeah, and he thought we had another legislator during the election year change his stance and didn't tell us on abortion. And we had endorsed him, and we were actually working hard. He lost his race by 765 votes. And I said to him, what do you think the moderates are going to vote for you if you let go of your strong stance on abortion? And he lost. And he lost to a very liberal, very pro-abortion LGBTQ candidate by 765 votes. So anyway, but all that said is that, people start talking, well, why was CTV endorsing this candidate? Well, we didn't know until 10 days beforehand. And then I was trying to get a hold of him, and we finally talked on the weekend before. And I said, why didn't you pick up the phone? Our integrity is on the line. And I shared this conversation with this other legislator, and I could see he's like, oh. So good. He's not bad-mouthing us. He knows that it was an innocent, we weren't aware. We were working in, 8 different areas of the state. But let's not jump to conclusions so fast. I'm just saying that. I'm just putting it out. So let's be constructive. Let's be reasonable. Let's call people up, talk to them. Local, city council, this is the easiest ones. You get to see them in your everyday life. But also your legislators, they will. You can make appointments with them and sit down and talk to them. I'm just saying, it's a good thing.